What I want to do now is save the scarce time that's available for our terrific, our distinguished panel. And General, I'd like to start off with you since you're first. Why don't you, we'll go just in that order. And Thomas, that's not any indication of your relative quality here. It's just the way people chose to sit down. Thanks. Thanks, Bob. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My remarks are going to be pretty brief because the Secretary has hit on the 2 points that I wanted to make. First and foremost, the National Guard is a valuable resource in responding to any emergency. I talk about the typical emergencies being floods, forest fires, hurricanes if you live in Virginia as we do, and the ravages that can bring to those affected areas. But the response to an EMP attack is something that is a super response, and one which I've continued to discuss with leaders at the Guard Bureau and within the states with whom I visit, that I think the Guard is falling short on preparation. The Secretary just mentioned support actions, the clearing of highways, the delivery of fuel, the security around key installations, all of these things the Guard does very well. But we need to look past the initial emergency actions that are going to occur and look to kind of peel the onion back and discover the second point that I want to make, and that is that we need to be prepared to operate in an environment where the typical support we give is not available. Communications, could they be affected? The ability to talk to units and to direct their operations in support of power or other facilities could be dramatically limited, in some instances totally eliminated. How do we communicate in those instances? Another important fact is fuel. And we take for granted that we all have diesel generators and those will work. Well, assuming they survive the initial EMP event, how long until those generators run out of fuel simply because we can't pump fuel to get to them into the vehicles? So these are just a couple common thoughts that we've shared among the various adjutants general that I've spoken with and had conversations at the National Guard Bureau. But I think it's safe to say that the Guard needs to go deeper in this in order to ensure that its ability to support the recovery from an EMP, whether it be to the power companies to get the power back on or simply to support our citizens that are in need of help, we need to do a better job of preparing that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Bob.
I guess I should follow on then with General Newman's comments.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, I apologize. Cynthia Ayers. I used to be the NSA visiting professor to the U.S. Army War College, but I should preface my remarks with the fact that I'm not speaking for the U.S. Army War College, nor for any other government organization in which I've ever worked. Having said that, when I joined the military, I was a service member for 7 years, not anywhere near as long as the general. And in that capacity, I understood what an EMP was vaguely. It was mostly rumor. As a Morse operator, I understood what sunspots were vaguely, but didn't really understand what could happen as a result of sunspots. I've since learned a lot more about those particular items. And I've also, as of 2005, when Ahmadinejad was elected, if you will, to the presidency of Iran, I did extensive research on him and on what he was saying, and soon discovered that he was talking about an EMP attack against the United States, as were other leaders. But in this particular case, I was much more interested in Ahmadinejad. He was much more threatening at the time. So I did a couple of papers for DNI publication. The idea of an EMP attack didn't seem to resonate with much of anybody. So in 2009, I found myself in Buffalo. And many of you who are out there in this audience right now were giving me information up on the podium, explaining to me what all of this was about. And I admit, even though I knew what an EMP was and I knew pretty much what it would do, I was horrified. I was absolutely dumbstruck with the possibility of the chaos, the loss of life, the fires, everything that could come from an EMP attack or a solar storm or a cyber attack for that matter. So I went back to the Army War College and I said, don't we need to be looking at this? Isn't this something we need to be doing something about? And got a lukewarm response until finally we got some end-of-year funds, and in 2010 we put on a small conference called In the Dark. It was almost the first real public-private conference that we had done. It was just kind of putting out feelers, and it really gave Impact America visibility in that particular regard with the Army War College. But we had a bit more, a number of obstacles to overcome after that. And we've been doing so. We have had several workshops and different kinds of things ever since, but they've been smaller. It's been more difficult to get the word out. This really, going back to the Buffalo Conference, what I immediately knew after hearing what you guys had to tell me was what would happen immediately upon people recognizing that this was a much more dire consequence than just having the electricity go off for a little bit of time. And that would be that people would start gravitating toward the military facilities that were closest to them, or the police facilities, or the fire facilities. So the first responders and the National Guard and the military in general were going to be the first people to really bear the brunt of the chaos of what could happen after an EMP. So I got in touch with Dr. Pry, and we started looking at that kind of at that issue. And I've since become immersed, but we really still need to do much, much more in that regard. This is still an issue that will be devastating for all of us, including the military, including the police, and including the emergency services. We need to war game, we need to exercise. We are not going to be able to know the enemy unless we learn about the enemy, whether that be a group of people or an attack mode, unless we study the enemy, unless we inform the people, the population of the enemy. And if I can leave you with anything at all, it would be that. We have got to inform the public, and they have to know what we're up against so that they can prepare. Thank you.
Is that working? All right. My name is Richard Andrus, and I'm a professor at the National War College, and I work at a think tank over there. So what I want to talk about a little bit is what we're doing in terms of exercises. I want to talk about sort of the state of where I see wargaming exercises on this topic. So about 6 years ago, my boss and friend, who was at the time the Secretary of the Air Force, he gave me a chair over at National Defense University, and he said, take some of these ideas, and I want you to take them out of theory, and I want you to help inject these things into the department. I want you to help inject these into national defense. So I went over there, and I helped, and hopefully over the years supported Congressman Bartlett and some of the other folks that were leading edge on this issue. And what we did is, over a period of years, we put on a large number of tabletops, exercises, seminars. We invited folks in from all across the bureaucracy. We tried to get senior folks in, as well as real experts from the Department of Homeland Security, Defense, Energy, and from the private sector. We pulled people together. We tried to be a coordinator to get these ideas and get people talking, get them thinking, and get the people who actually controlled the infrastructure in contact with the bureaucratic entities that regulated, administered it, and formed the laws that govern it. So that was our plan. And I think that we and the other folks that have been working along these lines, that have been coordinating this, have done a pretty good job. 2 weeks ago, the director of the National Security Agency, Admiral Rogers, he came out and he said, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So these ideas that seem like science fiction not so long ago have made it to the point where our national leaders in the United States understand and are working to implement them. And I'm not going to talk about what the threats are, because we've talked about that so many other times, and I think that most of the folks who came here today understand how important these threats are. But what I want to talk about is the next step. We have the leaders of the country, the leaders of the national security bureaucracy now who understand this, but that's not enough. This has got to get out there. It's got to get into the private sector. It's got to get out into the country. And people have got to understand their stake in this and their ownership in this, which means the next level of exercises, tabletops, and war games need to be done by private industry. There are unbelievable sums of money at stake for the banks, for telecommunications, for IT, for many different organizations out there. There's a stake for the insurance companies. And what we need to do now is translate this concern, this understanding about what the risk is and what the threat is. We need to get specific organizations to understand what their piece of that is. And that means the next phase in wargaming and tabletops and exercises needs to go out to private industry. We need to get risk assessment from bankers, from insurance companies. We need them to put on exercises where they can bring in stakeholders who can look at this risk that's been assessed now by the government, by the military, by our agencies, and translate that into what that means in terms of premiums, what that means in terms of what they're going to do. Because until people understand the financial stakes that are involved in this, it's not going to move forward. Congress is not going to be able to move forward until folks out there, citizens, understand what their piece of this is and can then tell those congressmen that they think this is important. So the next step here has to be moving out to industry. And I think that there are a number of folks here at this conference today who are able to do that and who are thinking about how to do that. Dave Hunt is one of those folks. So that's the next step. And with that, Dave, I will turn over to you.
Thank you very much. I had the pleasure of working on the exercise planning committee and facilitating the exercise yesterday. I actually wrote all of Rich's comments so I could follow up on exactly what he was saying. Hopefully you guys that were there yesterday, which included many of you. How many of you were at the exercise yesterday? Just show of hands. Yeah, we had about 2/3 of you. Yesterday, but those of you who were there, you have an idea of my sense of humor, so I apologize, Rich, for making you the butt of my joke. Yesterday, we tried to develop a prototype to follow on exactly what Rich is saying. For those of you who've been here for a number of years and have been probably frustrated as I am at the glacial pace of this process in educating the public and in raising this issue, there were a lot of people that said, listen, we'd like to do an exercise, we'd like to put together a training seminar, we're not really sure, we don't have the technical expertise ourselves to do it, how can we do that? So because I'm a friend of Chuck's, we always say yes to anything that's asked. So we ended up coming up with this concept of trying to design a prototype to be available through the EMP SIG to any of the organizations that wish to take this another step further in their own community. And yesterday we tried to essentially launch that program with the prototype, and we used the opportunity yesterday to kind of have you drink from a fire hose of the entire process. We don't recommend anybody do that. It's too brutal to the participants. But we wanted to show you what we had developed for your use. And it's a combination of the workshops, educational workshops we had in the morning. It's a combination of the 3 different tabletop exercise scenarios in terms of cyber, solar, and EMP that are available for your use. And again, our recommendation is don't try to do all 3. They're too repetitious. It really doesn't matter why 150 million people are out of power. You still got the same problem. So if you wrestle in one scenario, you wrestle with the other. We're also going to be making available a planning guide that follows up on this. So you can take the planning guide, take the materials that we have, and you can figure out ways that you can modify this material to your own needs, to personalize it to your own jurisdiction, put in the name of your energy providers, your local nuclear plants, whether it's the Bureau of Fire or the Fire Bureau. You can make sure that these things are accurate and relevant to your own needs. So yesterday, we got a lot of good feedback on what we had done. And I think that we have made a significant stride in the education piece. I've been in exercises for a long time, and I firmly believe that they are an outstanding way to engage people. One of the biggest complaints we had yesterday is we didn't have enough time in the discussions to further discuss what we really would have liked to have done. And that's why we're saying, make sure you don't try to do it all. Leave time for those discussions. That's where you really get the input. That's where you get the buy-in from the participants. Like Rich was saying, I think there's a need to educate the public. We can't do it alone. We need industry. We need our responder agencies to engage the public, to engage our private nonprofit partners. So this will provide an opportunity for you to take this material and move it forward. The other thing that was available to you as part of the package yesterday was the bibliography of resource material, and also the read-ahead package, which provides an overview for any of the exercise participants, particularly those from the private sector and the public who have not been exposed to this material before. It gives them some background information so they can come to the exercise better prepared to participate. So in a nutshell, that's what we tried to do yesterday. We thank all of those who participated. We thank you for your input. We will be taking all of that and incorporating it. One suggestion I think was very well done. It was to take the modules and break them out. So each module you would then evaluate what happened at the end of the first week, what happened at the end of the first month, and then what's the long-range recovery picture look like. And that gives you logical breaks to have different discussions on it. You can break up so you're not reading 60 slides at once or whatever it happened to be. So I think all those things are very positive, and I thank you for your input and your participation.
And so I'm Thomas MacLellan. I'm with the National Governors Association. I head up Homeland Security and Public Safety on the Center for Best Practices, and I want to commend you, David, that the exercise, the setup with the scenarios was really, really quite excellent. And so I really appreciate it. I actually learned a lot just kind of thinking about the long-term downstream consequences. So at NGA right now, we are just beginning to take a look at this. I mean, not just. We've been on it for maybe a year and a half or so, just as an organization. And again, like the good professor down there, I don't represent any governors. I'm speaking just kind of from my seat as the division chair, so I'm not representing any particular state. But for us, I think the notion that we're looking at is the response. If it's an EMP or a cyber or solar weather or something else, a tree branch falling down in Washington State, cutting down the whole left coast, we don't really care necessarily about what the cause is. I mean, to some extent we do. What we're beginning to look at is what the response is and what the response taxonomy for governors will be in the case of a major power outage. And how that power outage occurs probably right now for where we are as an organization providing governors tools and resources is probably less important. That said, you have to look at the construct of our government, that when something happens in the country, it doesn't happen in the country, it happens in a state, locality too. But in the end, when something big and hairy happens, it really will be the governors who will be responsible for the response. The federal government through FEMA will support the sovereign rights of states, but they do that in support of the governors. And so, the issues that we're talking about here are very unique in so much that there are big disasters. There's been the hurricanes and there's been tornadoes, but nothing that we've seen really kind of rises to this level. And so there are some questions that remain unanswered. What happens? Will the NRF, will the National Response Framework fail under the test of such a major disaster if the whole right half of the country goes down, or the middle half, or something like that? Not even talking the whole country. What happens? Will the support functions hold? Will the Interstate Emergency Compact hold? I don't know. And so what we're beginning to do is help governors begin to think through how you will need to respond to these issues when things go down. I mean, one of the things I learned yesterday, and I think I've thought about it kind of intellectually, but it didn't come out to me until about, talking about, I think about the third or fourth week. You've got corrections, you've got prisons and jails, about 1.2 million people, not all of whom are nice, who may be coming out, or getting out or forcing their way out. And when you start talking about civil unrest and government breakdown and so forth, that it really kind of raises just that one particular piece. When you look at some of the lessons from Katrina with the prisoners on the bridge, and you look at some of the sex offenders that they lost, and I believe they've probably located them all now, but I know that there was a time when there were folks out that they could not identify, they could not locate, and that raises some pretty serious public safety concerns. And so we're looking at ways that we can begin to educate governors about the potential causes, some potential steps they can take to prevent and mitigate. But really we're focusing right now on the response piece. And I think some of the constitutional questions about martial law, and one of the questions that came up in the thing yesterday, and I'm not advocating for martial law, anybody here, that can the government take someone's stockpile? Let's say someone's really well prepared and they have a a warehouse full of, their own private warehouse full of stuff that may be essential to the common good. Can the governor take it? Maybe. I don't know, but some of those questions are untested. And so we want to begin to look at ways and strategies that governors can begin to think about how you respond in the event of a disaster. And I want to go back to something that Dr. Stockton was talking about, was the notion of kind of prioritization. So we hosted a work group not quite a year ago, where we brought together folks from the states and private sector and so forth, and we had some discussions just to kind of to educate us and others about some of the issues and what governors should be thinking about it. And for me, one of the key watchwords that came out of that whole discussion was the notion of prioritization, and that when things go down, when the skies go dark, and you lose your power for 3 months, there are going to be some very tough choices that need to be made between hospitals or chemical plants or nuclear plants or communication or food production or something. But there will be winners and there will be losers, and so we're in untested waters. So, Paul, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. Well, the remarks were admirably short and to the point. I want to thank you for that. Because that gives us plenty of time for questions and comments from the floor. All of you are leaders in this realm. We're not going to make progress without you. So if I could ask that you please identify yourselves and direct your question either to the panel as a whole or to an individual. Before we do that, though, let me return to my basic point. I gave you my vision of a strategy for what might work for the prioritized investment in hardening and protection against EMP. Remember, it's going to have to work for industry, and it's going to have to work for public utility commissioners that are responsible for their ratepayers to only allow projects to go forward that are prudent and cost-effective. So beginning to get down to that level of granularity, to treat EMP, scary as it is, as another risk to manage with targeted investments that are cost-effective. That's the way forward. Thanks. Who'd like to go first?
Please identify yourself as well. Bill Harris with the Foundation for Resilient Societies. So I have a question for the panel chairman. And a brief background, I do filings for this foundation on physical security and cybersecurity and solar weather, et cetera. And what I find that's striking, and we raised this with the OSD officials last week, nobody appears before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission who represents the Department of Defense, not the General Counsel, not anybody else. And we get told by the FERC staff, we need you to file, because if we don't put evidence in a docket record, the commissioners are not allowed to use evidence from outside the record. So we've asked them, can't you have your staff file? Well, some regulatory bodies do that, but FERC doesn't do that. So we've suggested if the Department of Defense has a strategy or develops one, or the National Security Council, it's not enough to have a strategy. They actually have to send people to the people who set reliability standards, who raise issues, should there be priorities for service to critical infrastructure or DOD missions or specific bases. And people just don't show up. So I think it's a problem. I don't know what you see for a solution.
Well, I'll take a whack at that. Let me emphasize, of course, that I'm no longer in office, that my successors have a chance to take on this opportunity. I think you've raised a very interesting opportunity for progress. Let me only say that, although I'm ignorant of the rules of FERC, I made a point when I was in office to talk with public utility commissioners, because we need to know, as you know, not only focus on the bulk power system, which is regulated by FERC, but from a national security perspective, the distribution systems are also vitally important. So I think there are a lot of partners in the regulatory realm that we need to collaborate with to bring along, and absolutely, national security is an important priority to take on, and it may be true that, now I'm speaking as a public citizen, the Department of Defense has done an excellent job of making sure that its own critical components for mission assurance and continuity are well protected against EMP, but installations depend and are part of broader communities. So So your points raise very important opportunities for progress.
I know we have more questions. I think we have one in the front row. Again, when you get the microphone, identify yourself and ask your question, please.
It's more of a comment on kind of the end result of all of you. I want to thank all of you for your training me. I'm a team leader in Team Rubicon, and I've been deployed 7 times to Sandy. Just got back from near Canada in the Washington wildfires, and I helped deploy DMAT teams. I want to just be short and thank all of you for your training at the FBI level, government level. I just got back visiting with the Surgeon General at the AMSIS convention here. That's why I'm wearing all of this. I just flew in, kind of, and I want to just thank you. That's all. The system is working, and we do support the National Guard and everybody else, and it's because of you I do my job. Thank you.
And what's your name?
Captain Dr. Kamansky. I was a former Army surgeon and dentist.
Well, I'm not sure that everybody knows about the terrific role that Team Rubicon plays. I'm familiar with it, of course, but I want to thank you and your colleagues for their service, bringing terrific military skill sets in support of disaster response, not only in the United States, but nationwide. It's a terrific resource. And would you mind saying just a couple more words about Team Rubicon, please?
Yes. I entered it when it was fairly small, and you know, what it is that it's the gap. That Rubicon is the gap between the immediate response of the first responders, police, fire, and then the long-term recovery. We're there for a couple of months in that gap, and that's about what we do. But the training, you know, my training in forensics with the FBI, the training that I received from Andrews Air Force Base at this convention, the system's working. It really is. Thank you.
Steve Christen, Homeland Security. To the panel as a whole, would you advocate Congress giving additional authority to the FERC to better control, let's say, the NERC, and ensuring that the grid was protected in a more timely manner, let's say?
I'd be happy to take that. Yeah, this is extremely important. This is extremely important because right now NERC is doing what you would expect it to do. NERC is a great organization, but NERC is owned by stakeholders who have an enormous, I mean, they have pressure. They've got to make a profit, and making a profit means avoiding regulation when possible. They've got to keep their overhead as low as possible, which means there's an enormous incentive for NERC to push back against anything that we're talking about here today. And I've seen this happen, and if you've ever been up on the Hill with, you know, listening to testimony, you'll know what I'm talking about. And this has been a, from my point of view, this has been the single biggest frustration that we've got. So until FERC has the authority to step in and make those regulations that that NERC putting out there no longer voluntary but mandatory, we're not going to begin to solve this problem. So to what you said, I'll foot stomp that and tell you that that is absolutely key that we do that.
Let me just follow on, Chuck, with that real quick, Richard. When you hear all the comments from our guests that have spoken before, and everyone will acknowledge that EMP, cyber, solar storms are a threat. You look at the national command authority of our country, the President and the highest DOD, they've taken extraordinary steps, Mr. Secretary, to ensure that the NCA is protected and can continue on following an attack. You look at comments from Kevin before, we talked about the Russians look at it as a threat because they buried their systems to protect it. And then you come back and you look to the citizenry of our country. The fact that we're out there without anyone, despite all the acknowledged, proven facts about the threats that are there and our vulnerabilities, and nothing's happened. So I think it speaks to the failure of our system to address what I think is a national security issue. And what Richard was saying about the FERC and the NERC's relationship, I think points to a key part of that failure, and that we can't have honest discussion without industry input that in this case is negative. It actually detracts from the solution rather than helps it. From a citizen and non-technical point of view, to me it's obvious the system we have, the relationship that is between FERC and NERC needs to be changed.
I agree. I also would think that not only do we need to grant FERC more authority, but we also need heavy oversight by Congress. And there are reasons for that, but I firmly believe in this case oversight is a definite, it's a must. Thank you.
I believe that progress is happening now on a voluntary basis. A growing number of energy companies, electric utilities, are beginning on their own, on a voluntary basis, to provide for targeted investment in resilience against E1 as well as E3. And I think we need to give them some credit and understand that progress can go forward in this way as well. But again, at some point, it needs to make a sense from a business perspective in terms of being able to recover costs for investments in hardening, and that's part of the challenge too.
Question from Congressman Bartlett. Roscoe Bartlett, retired public servant. During the Cold War, I attended a forum where the question was asked, what is the most aggressive thing the Soviets could do short of actually launching their missiles? I was surprised at the answer. The answer was, start building a robust fallout shelter program. I wonder if our actions of hardening our grid could be so conceived and therefore invite an earlier attack.
Is it on? Yeah, Congressman. My background, I'm a political scientist and I study deterrence issues, international relations. I am not personally terribly afraid that the Russians are going to attack us with an EMP. And I don't think the Chinese will either. The reason I'm not worried about that is because the effects would be so extreme on our country that we would probably retaliate massively. They know that. And so I'm not terribly worried about the Russians and the Chinese. I am concerned, though, about the Koreans, the North Koreans. I'm concerned about the Iranians because both those governments could easily, in the next few years, find themselves about to disappear. They could be in the position that Saddam Hussein was in. And if you were in that position and you were an Iranian leader or a North Korean leader, you might say to yourself, you know, hey, we're going anyway. We have nothing to lose. We might as well do this before we go. And I don't think that that's unrealistic. And I also think that it's possible that some non-state entities, if they were to get this capability, might use it. So I don't think that hardening the grid is going to provoke anyone. All it's going to do is make us safer. I don't see any downside in that way to it, sir.
Let me ask a technical question to which I do not know the answer. I'm sure that neither Russia nor China is going to directly attack us. But like the Russian ambassador said at that meeting that I was privileged to be at, they would launch from the ocean. Are we sure that we would know the signature of that weapon so that we could trace it to its origin? You know, a non-state actor can do this. All you need is a tramp steamer, a Scud launcher that costs you $100,000, and any crude nuclear weapon. That won't shut down the whole United States, but it'll sure as heck take out the mid-Atlantic region. It'll take out every city from Boston to Norfolk and west to Pittsburgh. That's a blow that is many times larger than Katrina. I don't know if it would be a fatal blow or not to our country. But can't they do this without leaving any signature so that we don't know who it came from?
Congressman, I'll tell you that this attribution is a huge issue in cyber. And I know finding out who threw the switch and who caused the problem is a deterrent in itself. When they can mask not only the vehicle, but the culprit themselves, it's a huge advantage for them and emboldens them to take steps. So I can't comment technically on whether or not we can firmly establish who launched something like that. I know our cyber efforts have gone a long ways in enabling us to assign attribution to this, but it's still a mystery. I think it's a priority for us to continue to work on this, and I think Mr. Secretary, if you know something different, please correct me, but I think Cyber Command this is one of the key nodes they're working on, trying to identify where these attacks come from, because the anonymous nature of these attacks makes those that would launch them feel a lot safer in doing so.
I would like to echo Congressman Bartlett's remarks. I think not only is there an attribution problem that we need to be thinking about, but unfortunately, by the time we would be able to establish who it was that attacked us, it would be too late. It would be irrelevant for us. So I do think this is a very big possibility. I also think that it's a possibility that Russia or China could be indirectly looking at this, and coalitions have already been established that I think we ought to be looking at heavily. Coalitions with Iran and North Korea by the Russians and the Chinese. So I agree wholeheartedly with your worries along those lines. Thank you, sir.
Identify yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Andrea Boland, recently a state legislator in Maine. And I wanted to just add who brought this bill to, as some of you know, who brought a bill looking for protections at the state level. A number of states now are trying to take different sorts of actions to also find a way to protect their grids. The main problem is NERC, because they set a profile standards that are totally unhelpful, and some would categorize as criminally negligent. When they know the extent of the threat and continue to downplay it, and we have seen it up close in Maine for the last year and a half, that even having their own data from the grid in Maine, don't even choose to use it, but instead set what they say should be a lower standard, which initially, and perhaps they'll return to it, they go back and forth, said to them, don't worry, you're fine, we don't need to do anything in Maine. And all the work that we've done in the state of Maine, and that others are contemplating doing in other states, can be just turned upside down by the Public Utilities Commission in conjunction with the power companies, just saying, well, we don't agree with what these independent experts who have done stellar work are saying. NERC says this, we'll just go with this, and we'll keep you vulnerable, essentially. Would you contemplate coming up with a different kind of an agency rather than NERC to set the standard so we don't really have the fox guarding the hen house?
I think the answer to this might be the reestablishment of the EMP Commission. Now, Cindy was talking about this earlier, but I think we need a unbiased, recognized panel of experts whose opinions can be valued and without prejudice make recommendations based on the facts. And I'm hoping perhaps that the senator from Wisconsin who spoke this morning, thank you, Mr. Secretary, yes, Senator Johnson might lead the charge on this. He seemed willing to hear more information about it, and perhaps it's time to re-engage that with. I think we've come a long way in the last 5 years in particular about a recognition of this. Maybe it's time to re-engage and have a candid conversation, and then, most importantly, have some action based on the findings of that commission. Cindy, anything or anybody else thoughts on that?
I just want to, Andrea, thank you, and thank you for all that you've done on this. I think everyone's aware of all the work that you've done and how hard you've pushed, and some of the frustrations that you've run into. NERC is a great organization. It's a private organization. It's an organization of private companies doing their best, but if they suffer from a collective action problem. And that is, if you're a member of NERC and somebody says, look, you're going to have to raise your rates, you're going to have to take these extra precautions, what happens? You're going to lose out to your competition that doesn't have to do it. NERC will always suffer from that. NERC is the fox guarding the hen house for good reasons. These are good people. But the way that it's set up today, NERC will never be able to solve this problem. And as long as NERC is the authority and able to say these regulations are only voluntary for you utility companies, NERC will not be able to solve the problem. And more than that, NERC will always stand in the way of any solutions that anyone brings up. Unless Congress can come together enough to say, all right, all of you guys, everyone has to meet the same standards. Everyone out there, NERC, you've got all of your members have got to do this. In that case, nobody has an advantage. Everybody's living under the same rules, and they're going to adapt to it, and then they're going to fix the problem. Because NERC has the technology, it has the wherewithal, it has the capital. It is industry, right? But you've got to get Congress to tell them you've got to fix the problem, and it's not voluntary, it's mandatory, and here's what you're going to do. That solves the collective action problem that they're dealing with at the moment. But yeah, I absolutely agree with you. As long as NERC is guarding the hen house, that's going to be a problem.
I just see things very differently. Somehow, despite this problem, a growing number of utilities are investing on a voluntary basis in hardening their critical systems against E1. There's no regulatory requirement for them to do so, and yet a growing number of utilities are doing it. And I think this is another model, it's another path forward, and it's way too soon to give up on this kind of collaborative progress, and I would hope that we'd be able to sustain that as well. Thanks.
I'm going to bring the microphone over here, but I have a question from Charlotte, North Carolina, Steve Volant. And this may be something that if this panel does not care to answer, perhaps another panel coming up would. What's the plan and who's responsible for nuke plant waste fueling cooling ponds and chemical plants and refineries that lose power and may catch fire? And we have another group that might be able to answer that, but if somebody wants to take a shot at it now, they may, and then I'll bring the mic over to my right.
I might suggest that Tom Popick is really the best person to answer that, or Bill Harris. So I suggest Tom Popick or Bill Harris actually answer that in regard to their input.
They'll have an opportunity in just a moment.
Okay.
Feedback here. Thank you. I have 2 mics and one's giving feedback. Go ahead. Acknowledge. What's your name?
I'm David Bardeen. I'm a retired volunteer, but one piece of my biography is I worked for FERC's predecessor from 1958 through 1969. I remember when NERC was not the corporation, but the newly created National Electric Reliability Council. I remember that Sunday in 1965 when I happened to be at the office, and my wife called up to say, something funny's going on. All those places north where we used to live and our friends used to live and are living, the lights have gone out. That was called the Great Northeast Blackout of 1965. So with that in mind, Dr. Stockton, I've got a question for you. I understand your point abstractly, and I think it's wonderful that some utilities are saying we're going to do more, better than the FERC regulations based on the NERC recommendations require us to do. I could even recite, because of a letter I've seen from one utility to its state regulators, one name of one utility. But it really doesn't do me much good just to say that in the abstract or to stop at your statement. Can you tell us the names, not necessarily of all the great utilities, but some of those utilities that are setting an example of what I would call best practices? If the FERC regulations based on the NERC recommendations aren't really the best practices, who are some of the utilities we should be patting on the back and holding up as examples to the rest of the utility industry?
Well, I think that we should take that back, Chuck, for action next year invite utilities to make their own case, to talk about what are the best practices, or more, what are the smart practices that are being developed by industry that now make sense from a business perspective, and broaden this dialogue so that those who are making progress can share some of what they're doing. Now, some of these technological solutions may be proprietary, and that's why I'm not going to comment on them today. It's for utilities to decide how much to share. But I do think that building more effective sharing mechanisms for emerging technical challenges that make sense from a business perspective, that's got to be part of the solution.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions or so. We've got people in sequence. I do know that there are some companies who've actually been active with our work, and some of the people in this room know who they are. In some cases they say, please don't tell anybody yet, but they sort of brag on the sly. So it's not totally unknown. There is some work being done, but I think I had a utility person saying, everyone who's a utility wants to be first at being second. And so I think if that's true, then when we get a few of these folks doing best practices, it may compel people to do more. And it certainly still doesn't inhibit anyone from declaring this best practice or something close to it as a new standard, as opposed to let's keep it as benign as possible. But we have another question. Please, I raise your hand, identify
Good afternoon.
yourself.
John from California in the telecommunications private sector, also with the InfraGard. Just a quick thing for Congressman Bartlett's question. I asked the exact same question yesterday of one of the experts, and the answer on the signature was that yes, the byproducts of these explosions can be signatured and mapped for proper interdiction of a follow-on event, as Kevin said. But my question goes to the response side of the equation. One entity that seems to be lacking both yesterday and today at this event, and they'll be the first to stick a camera or a microphone in front of your faces to get their snapshot when something does happen, is the press. And my great concern, as has been evidenced over the last few years with the disasters of various types that we've seen in this country, and I'm going to be uniformly insulting to all of them, is that they completely lack subject matter expertise, and they completely lack the ability to keep the public calm. And my question is to the governor's panel, gentlemen, and anybody else here that mentioned they were on the response side, is there a plan also in parallel being developed other than what we have in the form of what we call the EAS at the federal level that in California we've seen used a number of times recently, and it seems to work, but over a prolonged outage, we're going to need competent, credible, calming information, and I don't think, and I hope I'm not going to get shot here, that our current state of the press is going to provide that by any means, by any stretch.
Excuse me, sir. You're really, thank you.
That was me, sorry.
I think we're having a localized power outage up here. So with respect to, I'm not going to comment on the press. There you are. I'm not going to comment on the press piece because that's just out of my wheelhouse. From the governor's side of things, I can tell you the governors take their responsibility as communicator-in-chief very seriously. And we spent a couple weeks ago, we do what we call the seminar for new governors. When governors come into office, the first thing that we work with them on is being prepared day one to respond to a disaster, whatever that disaster is, man-made, terrorist, natural. One of the cornerstones is working out those communication strategies so there's a unified message that if you don't know, you say you don't know, but begin to build those things out immediately from day one. And so we spent a whole day, they got a classified briefing. We were able to do some, work with them about thinking through where you sit, where you stand, how you communicate, what words. If you don't know, you don't know how you access information. So from our perspective, we work very closely, and the governors take their responsibility as communicators-in-chief very, very seriously. As to the press, I can't really comment to that.
Let me take a whack at that. One of the things I've done over the past several years is spent about 5 years working with states, major cities, regions in the development of public information strategies and coordinated public information messaging. And one of the things that we try to do, and it's very difficult in a large region, is to get a single unified message out in a timely fashion. It sounds very simple, but it's actually very difficult. One of the advantages we have today is we have the ability to go on the web, we have the ability to use the tweets to get a message out directly from the jurisdiction to the public. We can bypass the media in that sense. And it's not a negative way. You can also feed the media, but you don't have to rely on them to convey the message and to put a filter on the message. So it seems to be working quite well in order of getting the message out. There's a lot of skill now over the past several years that's been adapted. We see a huge following on the Twitter feeds that are coming out of the organizations. The other half of your question is what happens in the event of a long-term power outage and the ability to use this. Well, all that is negated, and the ability then to communicate with the media is likely to going to be from the mayor or the governor or county commissioner, whoever it happens to be, in a face-to-face thing, and well, that's all bets are off right now. So there are good strategies currently that are being in place and improved on a daily basis, but in an EMP, all bets are off.
We have one more web question, and then we'll have to take a stop. It's maybe where I'm standing. I'm going to reword this. Can the Critical Infrastructure Protection, I assume, Act be extended to cover this issue? Isn't it enforceable? Of course, it only passed the House if that's the act referring to. But since we've been talking a lot about the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, which will compel DHS to study this and to do R&D in this field, is there a sense from any of you or a couple of you about the effectiveness of this proposed act that's just been passed by the House and is now hopefully going to the Senate, at least hopefully in the minds of the people who have passed it in the House?
I know that Virginia's legislature will take this bill up. There is a bill pending at the current legislature that will address the same issues that the House has brought forward with the SIPA Act. I think the key will be what we do with it. We can study it, we can exercise with it, but if we make no changes to the procedures we use to address it, I think we'll be back in the same boat we are today.
Echo that. If the bill passes, there will be an additional scenario added to the national list of scenarios that can be addressed by the locals and states. There is no requirement for the states and locals to address those. And right now there is, there's a debate on how you plan. You can either do capability-based planning, where you look at what capability your jurisdiction would need to respond to an event, and then you build that. It means what type of equipment, what type of staffing, training, protocols do you need to handle it. And another way to evaluate that, which is what I recommend, is then you go through the different scenarios and you evaluate how your capabilities that you have developed would stack up in the event of various scenarios. There's no requirement for any jurisdiction to do that. There's also no requirement that I'm aware of in the bill for DHS to fund this going any farther than adding the scenario. So in my opinion, it needs to be more than just the scenario placed in the list of 16 scenarios that they should be able to respond to. It needs to go further than that.
Dr. Stockton, would you like a concluding remark for your panel this morning? Thank you again for coming.
I would, and I think that's a great way of wrapping things up. EMP is just another high-consequence risk to manage. Let's treat it as such. There are sensible ways to move forward and make progress. Our goal now is to accelerate the progress that's already been happening and to work together to make sure that as we assume we have to, from a prudence perspective, that this might happen, that if it does happen, we'll be ready to be able to much more rapidly accelerate the restoration of power that would otherwise be possible. So thanks to all of you on the panel, and thanks to you for the progress that you're helping make.